So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint loose watercolor roses in Procreate. Personally, I've always struggled with these for some reason, but I think I've figured out this kind of backwards painting strategy that's made it a lot easier. As always, I'll list the brushes I'm using in the description below. And to paint roses like this, I'm going to create the outermost petals first. So for that, I'm going to use the Aurora Quill brush. And I want this to be a sort of red or pink rose. So the rose I'm aiming for is going to be about like this color. But for the outer petals, I like to use a very light version to start. And I'll use this brush at kind of a medium size. And I'm going to do a kind of circle of petals like this. And I'm just starting with a very light pressure, pressing harder and then tapering it off again. After the outer petals, I'll move and do the inner ones. And these are going to be the darkest shade of our flower color. So I'll select a color like this. I'll shrink my brush size. And I'll start by doing this sort of spiraling complexity in the center here. Just a bunch of these short kind of arcs that are connected. And once the center's finished, I'll make the brush size a little bit larger. And I'll do a few rings of larger petals. And once I've reached kind of like a halfway point to the outer petals, I'm going to lighten my color and choose a mid-tone. So here's the darkest flower color, then here's the one we used for the outer petals. I'm going to choose something just in between, and I'll finish the flower with a few more layers of petals. And then to add contrast, I'm going to add a couple of dark petals in this mid-tone area. So I'll choose a darker kind of flower tone color, not quite the darkest one. Small brush size, and I'll just add a few lines kind of in this area. And that pretty much finishes the main structure of the flower. You can see though, there's a lot of unusual kind of overlapping strokes that look a little bit like marker. So the next step here is going to be the blending. Now, before we can do the blending though, we need to solve a sort of invisible problem here. And basically, all the stuff we've painted so far is very transparent. And I'll show you what I mean. So here's our rose. I'll select a blank layer underneath it. And I'll just draw some random lines. And you can see the rose is transparent enough that it's showing the lines through it. And we need to eliminate that effect. So for now, I'll turn off my squiggles. I'll select my rose layer. I'll duplicate it and select the bottom one. Then I'll go to Hue, Saturation, and Brightness. And I'll raise the brightness to max. And you can see here, it's just made like a white version of our rose. I'll make 2 more copies of it. And then I'll merge all of that together onto one layer. And now when I turn my scribbles back on, they're pretty much entirely blocked out by the rose. There's still a tiny bit of transparency remaining, but I'd say 90% of it is gone. And now for the blending, I'm going to change my brush to the water blender. And I'll use it at a medium size. And out here in this area, for example, I can soften some of these kind of overlapping strokes. But there's a problem because if I go beyond the edge of the flower, it actually just blurs out into the white area. Now in this area, you could just very carefully blend and avoid doing that. But it's pretty much impossible in the center of the flower because there's just so much detail. And if you tried to blend this, you'd ruin the structure. So to avoid doing that, we need to use a feature called Alpha Lock. So if you go into the Layers panel and tap on the flower layer, it'll open up this menu and you can tap on Alpha Lock. Now when I use the water blender again, I can still blend just as I did before, but it won't let me go beyond the edge of the artwork and into the white area. And the blending technique is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to start in the center of the flower and sort of work my way out. And I'm just kind of tapping the brush and doing short strokes with it. And it will really depend on your personal art style. But I like to blend in such a way that makes everything a little bit soft, but there's still quite a few hard edges left. And there we go. I think this blending looks really good. The next step here is also related to blending, and it's optional. And it's something you might be familiar with if you've used traditional watercolor on paper. Sometimes this thing happens where you have a lot of pigment and water in one area, and then when it dries out, it sort of creates this thing called a backrun. And if you want to achieve that effect, we have to turn Alpha Lock off. So again, I'll tap on my flower layer and then tap on Alpha Lock to disable it. Then I'll grab the selection tool, set to freehand, and I'll zoom in on any random area of the flower. Ideally, it should be a place where there's a lot of dark, medium, and light tones. It'll just make it more interesting. I'll make a selection that covers that area, but avoids any of the white areas. So I've made sure my selection doesn't go into any of these white areas. Then I'll feather out the selection about 10%. I'll go to Gaussian blur, and I'll apply a very light blur, just to soften the edges a bit. Then I'll go to my adjustments again, and this time I'll use liquefy. It's set to crystals. I recommend setting the size here pretty large. If it's small, you won't really see any visible effect. So I'm going to use it around 70 or 80%. And I'm just going to scribble this around. And it's hard to explain what's happening, but it's sort of disrupting the colors, and it looks a lot like a background. And once you're happy with how it looks, you can just tap on the selection tool to kind of go out of that mode. And usually this looks fine, but sometimes you'll have it create something a little bit unrealistic. And this area in particular is bugging me. So I'm going to go back to the water blender, and I'll just soften some of those areas. And I really like how this looks, so I'm going to do it again over here. So once again, I'll grab the selection tool. I'll select some kind of high contrast area. Then I'll feather out the selection about 10%. Then I'll go to my Gaussian blur, and I'll blur it just a tiny bit. Then I'll go to liquefy, crystals, and just kind of mess with the colors. After that, I'll leave this selection mode, go back to my water blender, and soften any of the areas that don't look right. And at this point, the rose is looking really good. I'm going to show you another kind of optional trick here. The rose is pretty much one color, it's just shades of pink, but I want to introduce some orange in here just to make it more interesting. So to do that, I'll grab the selection tool again, set to freehand. I'll just select one area like this. I'll feather out that selection quite a bit. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I can introduce the orange by shifting the hue. And I can also mess with the saturation and the brightness as well. And using a similar process, I can also darken the center. So again, freehand selection tool, I'll circle that area, feather it out, hue, saturation, and brightness, and this time I'll darken it and saturate it. And there we go. I think this rose is finished. I could definitely go in there and do a little more creative blending, but I feel like it's good enough and I'll leave it as it is. Next, I'm going to move on and show you how to paint some simple stroke-based leaves. And those are going to be on their own layer, and I'll put the layer below the flower. For the color, I'm going to stick with a sort of pastel blue-green tone. And for the brush, I'm going to continue with the Aurora Quill, around a medium size again. And all my leaves are stroke-based, which means I'm just starting with like a light pressure, pressing harder, and then tapering it off again. And I'm going to use this technique to paint a bunch of leaves, and I'm going to shift my color each time just so the leaves don't look all the same. And these leaves look pretty good, and you can see in a few areas how they're sort of overlapping and making a darker area. You could leave this, but I like to blend it. So I'll switch back to the water blender and just soften them up using this. After that, I want to make a shadow. So basically the flower is sort of in the front and these are just behind. So I want to add a drop shadow. So for that, I'll grab the freehand selection tool and I'll just go around and circle all the edges that are close to the rose. I'll reconnect it, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken that area. And I think these leaves might also look nice if they have some color variation. So again, I'll grab the selection tool and just select a random part of each leaf. This time I'll feather out the selection. hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll darken it, saturate it, and then shift the hue just to drop in an interesting kind of secondary tone. And once I'm happy with how the leaves look, I'm going to merge everything together onto one layer and maybe do a little bit of blending where the leaves are touching the flower. Now, you don't have to do this, but I think it looks nice if this area is a little bit soft. So to do that, grab the selection tool. Just circle the area where the leaf kind of meets the rose. I'll feather it out a little bit, Gaussian blur, and I'll just soften it like that. And you don't have to do this to every leaf. I'll just do it to a few of them to make it interesting. And just like that, this watercolor rose is finished. I didn't really cover it in this video, but hopefully you can see how you can combine these flowers together and make a larger arrangement. I will say though that I'm always surprised at how good these flowers look just by themselves, and I think it's because they do have a sort of zen kind of quality to them, and it just lends itself to that. As usual, if you think I've earned it, please give this video a like, and here are 2 more flower tutorials I think you'll love to watch next.